I sank into the worn armchair in my childhood bedroom, the familiar scent of lavender and polished wood wrapping around me like a memory I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Yet tonight, it felt like a battlefield. The quiet of the house contrasted sharply with the storm of thoughts swirling through my head. At 57, I should have known better than to let anticipation get the better of me. But the years of family manipulation had a way of sneaking in unannounced, like an unwanted guest. My eyes flicked to the clock, 10:57 p.m. The soft hum of the ceiling fan barely masked the creak of floorboards in the hallway. Lydia would be arriving any minute. She had already insinuated herself into every detail of my wedding, from floral arrangements to seating charts, with the kind of insidious charm that made it impossible to say no without seeming petty or ungrateful. She was 32, married to my son Nathan, and possessed that unnerving mix of politeness and quiet superiority that left me perpetually on edge. I didn't trust her, not entirely, and tonight's nervous anticipation only sharpened that instinct. I rose slowly, brushing invisible dust from the surface of my dresser. The mirror reflected a woman, both familiar and foreign, my face lined with the years of joys and betrayals, my hair pinned loosely back in preparation for bed, and my hands still slightly trembling from the day's nerves. For decades, I had been aware of the family's pattern. Lydia positioned as the favored daughter-in-law, pampered and coddled, while my accomplishments and sacrifices were quietly minimized, filed away behind polite smiles and strategic compliments. Even Nathan, who loved me in his way, seemed to tread lightly, careful not to disrupt the fragile equilibrium Lydia had claimed. A soft knock at the door pulled my attention. "Clara, is that you?" Lydia's voice, smooth and honeyed, floated through the door. I swallowed a tight laugh, forcing a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Yes, I'm here." My voice was steadier than I expected, though I felt the tremor beneath it. The door opened, and there she was, smiling, carrying a small tray with a teacup. "I thought you might like something to relax before bed," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward mine, just long enough to make me question whether the gesture was genuine. There was a subtle smirk lingering at the corners of her lips, one that promised I might not be entirely in control of what came next. I nodded, accepting the cup with both hands. The liquid was warm, fragrant, and familiar, yet I could not shake the sense that this simple act of care might conceal something else. My mind wandered briefly to the past moments, when Lydia's presence had shifted the family's attention away from me, the countless times she had been quietly elevated while my efforts went unnoticed. It was a subtle, constant pressure, like a current pulling at the edges of a delicate tapestry. And now, on the eve of my wedding, that current felt stronger than ever. I settled back into the chair, sipping the tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest, trying to imagine calm. Yet even as I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would not be ordinary, that behind Lydia's smile, the quiet patience in her gaze, something far more deliberate was brewing. I set the cup down and exhaled slowly, bracing myself. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, but tonight, the house seemed alive with whispers I could not yet hear. Lydia set the tray on the small table beside my armchair, the delicate china clinking softly against the silver. "Here," she said, voice honeyed and smooth, a little chamomile, "just to help you relax before bed." Her eyes lingered on mine, with a flicker I couldn't quite read, a subtle glint that made my stomach tighten. I lifted the teacup with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. The scent was familiar, soothing and faintly floral, but there was something underlying it, a bitter note I couldn't place. I blinked, dismissing it. After the whirlwind of planning seating arrangements and family expectations, I was too exhausted to scrutinize every detail. I needed the comfort, needed the semblance of calm, and I wanted to believe Lydia's gesture was genuine. "You've had such a long day," she said, perching delicately on the edge of the chair across from me. "I thought this might help you unwind." She adjusted the skirt of her pale green dress, smoothing the fabric with practiced care. Every motion was meticulous, calculated, designed to reassure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the reassurance was layered a mask for something else. I sipped. The tea was warm, sweet, comforting, but the bitter undertone lingered, crawling at the edges of my consciousness. I swallowed and forced a smile. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful of you." Lydia tilted her head slightly, the faintest smirk curling at the corners of her lips. "Of course," she said softly. "I know how important tomorrow is. I just want everything to be perfect for you, for Nathan, for the family." Her words hung in the air, innocuous, yet weighted, as if reminding me that perfection was her domain. I took another sip, trying to settle the flutter in my chest. Her presence was deceptively gentle, yet it carried an unspoken authority. Every suggestion, every comment about flowers or table arrangements was a reminder that she had quietly positioned herself in control. I had spent decades navigating the subtle manipulations of family members, but Lydia's tactics felt sharper, more deliberate, more insidious. I studied her, while she spoke about minor details, the angle of the chairs in the chapel, the placement of candles, the precise folding of napkins. Her smile never wavered, but behind it I could sense the faint pulse of expectation, a quiet demand that I follow her lead. It wasn't aggression. Not exactly. It was a controlled assertion, a test of compliance. I shifted slightly, resting my palms on my knees. Something inside me bristled. A suspicion I had long ignored, the one that whispered when subtle patterns of control appeared, began to surface. Was this cup of tea truly meant to calm me? Or was it the first piece in a puzzle I didn't yet understand? My mind ticked through decades of familial favoritism, of seeing others elevated at my expense, of the quiet ways my voice had been diminished. I set the cup down, feeling the warmth lingering in my fingers, and leaned back, trying to steady my breathing. Tomorrow would bring clarity, whether I wanted it or not. But tonight, the unease settled over me like a shadow, subtle yet undeniable. And as I let my eyes wander toward the closed door, I sensed that what seemed like a simple act of care might not be what it appeared, and that the night ahead would test the boundaries of trust in ways I could not yet imagine. The warmth of the tea lingered on my tongue, a fleeting comfort that barely masked the haze creeping through my mind. My eyelids felt heavy, weighted, as if they carried every expectation, every whispered criticism, every subtle slight I had endured over decades. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was simply tired, that the chaos of wedding planning and family politics had finally caught up with me. But then I heard her. Shave her head. Lydia's voice cut through the quiet like glass, sharp and deliberate. Or I leave, forever. The words struck me with a force I hadn't anticipated, slicing through the fog of exhaustion and warmth. My stomach dropped. My hands gripped the armrests, and a cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the statement, but everything felt surreal, distorted. Lydia stood there, calm and unnervingly composed, yet her eyes were flames of quiet determination, a challenge I wasn't sure I could meet. Margot's voice trembled in response. "Lydia, please. You don't mean that." But I could hear the hesitation, the uncertainty, the tiny crack in the matriarchal armor my mother had so carefully constructed over 80 years. And then impossibly, it gave way. I could see it in the way her hands faltered, in the way her eyes darted to Lydia, as though seeking permission from the younger woman, rather than asserting her own judgment. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the air heavy with anticipation and fear. Lydia didn't move. She didn't have to. The threat hung there, suspended between us, an ultimatum that forced compliance without raising a hand. "You promised me," she said softly, but with an edge that left no room for doubt. "If you don't do this, I walk out tonight. You'll never see me again. Not at the wedding, not at any family gathering, not ever." The sedative fog made my thoughts sluggish, but not my horror. I tried to speak, to protest, to call out the injustice of it all, but my voice felt thick, distant, as though someone else had taken over. My chest tightened. The betrayal was absolute, immediate, visceral. I wasn't just being challenged. I was being dismantled piece by piece by someone who had mastered the art of quiet cruelty. Margot's lips quivered as she murmured, "I can't." The words stumbled out incomplete, swallowed by Lydia's insistence and the oppressive weight of inevitability. And then the decision was made. I could see it in my mother's eyes, the flicker of resignation, the concession to fear rather than conviction. My heart sank further, a leaden weight anchoring me to the floor, to the realization that I was powerless in that moment. Shock and disbelief washed over me, mingled with a pulse of raw, unfiltered fear. I had never felt so small, so exposed, so utterly at the mercy of another adult, let alone my own child-in-law. The betrayal was a physical sensation, a tight knot in my stomach, a prickling at the nape of my neck, an ache in my chest that refused to dissipate. And yet, beneath the dread, a spark flickered, tiny and hesitant at first, like a candle struggling against the wind. Even as my body trembled with helplessness, my mind began to edge toward clarity. I was 57, and though the years had tempered my reflexes, they had sharpened my resolve. Something deep inside whispered that this would not define me, that the humiliation would not claim the totality of my spirit. I pressed my fingers to my temple, taking a shallow, controlled breath. I would survive this night. I would endure. And when the time came, I would ensure that the power wielded over me tonight would be reclaimed, repurposed, turned back against those who sought to control me. The room was silent now, except for the faint rustle of fabric and the measured breathing of Lydia and my mother. The first emotional spike had passed, but the weight of it lingered, pressing down with an intensity that promised tomorrow would be a turning point in more ways than one. And in that moment, even as the sedative tugged at my consciousness, I began to form a plan, a quiet, burning resolve that would carry me through the night and into a day that would be nothing like what anyone expected. The hum of the clippers filled the room, a low, insistent buzz that seemed to reverberate through my chest. My mind swirled in disbelief as I tried to process what I was seeing. Lydia held the device with a deliberate calm, precise in every motion, while my mother, Margot, hovered nearby, guiding the angle of the clippers with hesitant hands. The woman who had raised me, taught me manners, celebrated milestones I thought mattered, now participated in dismantling me one strand of hair at a time. I pressed myself against the far wall, as far from them as I could get, but the sedative dulled my reflexes, leaving me frozen in both body and mind. I wanted to scream, to protest, to tear the device from Lydia's hands, but my limbs refused their commands. All I could do was watch every pass of the clippers, a betrayal etched into my scalp and my memory. The first lock fell, landing on the polished floor like a dark, heavy weight. I remembered every moment of favoritism, every subtle inequity that had built over decades. I had been careful, conscientious, obedient. I had excelled in school, balanced a career, managed my household, and yet my accomplishments had always been footnotes in the family narrative, overshadowed by the charm, beauty, and manipulations of others. First my sister, now my daughter-in-law. I remembered holidays spent making sure everyone else was celebrated, while my own achievements were glossed over. My high school graduation had been minimized. Birthdays for me were polite afterthoughts, and every time I shined, someone else's light was strategically placed to dim mine. All of it had led to this moment of complete exposure and powerlessness. The clippers moved again, scraping across my scalp, and the metallic scent of hair, cut short, mingled with the faintly floral aroma of the tea I had sipped earlier. My fingers instinctively reached up, tracing the path of the buzzing machine. The sensation was alien, a mixture of pain and violation. Some patches were completely bare, others left in uneven tufts, red and tender from pressure. I could hardly recognize the woman staring back at me in the mirror, the reflection of my childhood self, my adult self. My dignity all stripped away in minutes. Margot's expression was a mask of conflict, tears threatening to spill, but her hands still steady, obedient to Lydia's silent demands. I could see the strain in her eyes, the quiet surrender to the assertion of power that I had always despised, but never anticipated facing so directly. The clippers moved methodically, cutting through more of my carefully grown hair, each strand a reminder of how expendable my feelings had always been to the people I trusted most. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in as the low buzz intensified. I thought of every subtle manipulation, every slight, every instance of being minimized. Each memory compounded the humiliation, layering past and present into a heavy, suffocating weight. And yet beneath the shock, a spark of clarity began to form, small and fragile, but undeniable. I would survive this. I would endure, and one day the power wielded against me would be reclaimed. I closed my eyes for a brief second, inhaling sharply, letting the initial wave of panic wash over me before channeling it into a cold, measured determination. This was not the end of my story. The betrayal was absolute, but my response could still define the course of the days to come. And as the final tufts of hair fell to the floor, I opened my eyes to my reflection once more, seeing not just the loss, but the spark of the resolve that had begun to burn within me, quietly promising that tomorrow would not belong to them. The sunlight slanted through the curtains, harsh and revealing, and I awoke with a start, the weight of exhaustion from the previous night still pressing on my body. My hand instinctively went to my head, expecting the familiar shoulder-length waves I had nurtured for months, carefully shaped for this day. The moment my fingers met bare skin, a jolt of panic surged through me, freezing my limbs. The scalp beneath my touch was raw, tender in places, and utterly exposed. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and looked down. Clumps of hair, some no longer than a quarter-inch, littered the floor like fallen leaves. My stomach turned nausea, rising sharply, and I staggered toward the mirror. Each step felt like wading through thick molasses, my mind struggling to keep pace with the realization. The reflection that met me was unrecognizable. The face familiar, yes, but framed by an empty, uneven crown where my hair should have been. Stared back with wide, disbelieving eyes, I traced my scalp slowly, gingerly, as if confirming that what I was seeing was real. The cold surface beneath my fingers, the prickling of tiny cuts and welts, the strange weightlessness where my hair had once been, it all screamed violation. My breath caught, and I pressed both palms to the mirror, searching for a version of myself that had not been stripped away overnight. Images from my past flooded in unbidden. Every birthday overlooked every achievement, minimized every holiday spent ensuring others' triumphs. Eclipsed mine, it all culminated in this moment. The favoritism, the carefully cultivated hierarchy within my family, the quiet way Lydia had wormed herself into a position of control. It had all been a slow, deliberate erosion of my dignity. and now it was laid bare for the first time. Margot's and Harold's faces flashed across my memory, voices of authority, shapers of a family narrative that always seemed to favor everyone else. I remembered my son Nathan's hesitant approval, his reluctance to confront Lydia the way he had always tried to mediate between my comfort and her whims. I remembered every subtle manipulation, every careful dismissal of my needs, every slight I had learned to endure silently, and now it all converged into a single, impossible moment. I sank to the edge of the bed, my fingers pressed to my temples, trying to quiet the spinning thoughts. The panic and horror still clung to me, but beneath it, something else began to emerge, a flicker of defiance, fragile but undeniable. I was 57, and while my body had aged, my mind was sharp. I had survived more than this, and I could survive what had just been done. I straightened, the resolve gathering strength with each deliberate breath. This day, which had been intended as a moment of public humiliation, would not define me. I would not hide. I would not let fear or shame dictate my actions. My reflection was no longer only a victim. It was the first image of a woman who would reclaim the power taken from her, who would turn betrayal into authority. The clumps of hair on the floor were not just reminders of humiliation. They were evidence of manipulation, of favoritism, of years spent in the shadow of others' ambitions. The mirror, once a reflection of vulnerability, now held the possibility of transformation. Every inch of bare scalp became a map of resolve, each mark a reminder that I would no longer passively endure. I rose fully and faced my reflection squarely. The fear was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but the spark of determination was stronger. I would not let this moment define me. I would take control quietly, deliberately, and with every intention of ensuring that those who thought they had power over me would soon learn otherwise. The day ahead would demand courage, cunning, and precision. I straightened my back, took a deep, steadying breath, and reached for the veil hanging by my closet. It would be my armor, my declaration, and the first step toward reclaiming what had been taken. The knock on the bedroom door was soft but deliberate. I froze mid-motion, my fingers lingering on the edge of the veil I had just lifted from the closet. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, telling myself I could face the day alone. But something inside me, a fragile thread of intuition, urged me to answer. "Aunt Fiona," I called cautiously. The door creaked open, and there she was, poised and unshakable, silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, eyes sharp and clear, despite the softening lines of 72 years. She smiled, though it was not the indulgent smile of a relative watching from a distance. This smile carried understanding, recognition, and the kind of unwavering moral authority that only came from decades of navigating complex family dynamics. "Clara," she said, gently stepping inside, "I heard what happened. I thought you might need me." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of relief I hadn't realized I craved. I sank into the armchair, the veil pooling at my side, and let the tension of the night seep out in the form of a shuddered breath. Aunt Fiona didn't flinch at my baldness, didn't offer the polite consolation of sympathy. Instead, she studied me, as though calculating the next move in a game she had played many times before. "You're not alone," she said, placing a steady hand on mine. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever again. We'll make sure this day goes exactly as it should. On your terms." Her confidence sparked something in me, a shift from the hollow panic of yesterday and last night to the glimmer of strategic resolve. I straightened my back, feeling the weight of age and experience grounding me, even as the nerves prickled along my skin. For the first time since waking bald, I saw a path forward. We spoke quietly but efficiently, Fiona suggested practical steps, arranging the veil to frame my face, intentionally selecting clothing that projected authority and composure, and practicing posture that exuded confidence even to those who might look for weakness. Each recommendation was simple but transformative. I realized the power of presentation, of turning what was intended as humiliation into a symbol of strength. "Clara," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "I've observed this family for decades. They thrive on control and perception. They think they've cornered you, but the truth is, they've underestimated how much you understand the patterns, how well you can anticipate their moves." Her words sank deep. Decades of subtle manipulation had not gone unnoticed. Every moment I had been minimized, every slight ignored by others, every carefully orchestrated preference for Lydia and Nathan, it had been catalogued in my mind. Now, with Fiona's support, I could translate years of observation into action. I allowed myself a small, resolute smile as I picked up the veil, draping it across my shoulders, and letting the soft fabric cascade down my back. It was no longer a symbol of concealment or fragility. It was armor, a declaration that I was present, prepared, and fully aware. Together, we worked through the room, adjusting folds, pinning the fabric, just so practicing a walk that would project dignity and control. I felt a renewed sense of authority, the kind that could not be shaken by the whispers, judgments, or attempts at sabotage I knew awaited me. As Fiona stepped back and nodded, I felt the first real surge of clarity and power since the betrayal began. I was no longer merely surviving. I was planning, calculating, positioning myself to turn the day to my advantage. The quiet strength radiating from her reminded me that allies could shift the balance of power even when the rest of the family had chosen betrayal. I inhaled deeply, straightened my shoulders, and braced myself for the steps ahead, knowing that the day would test every ounce of courage I had gathered. But I would not face it alone. And as the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, I could feel the resolve settling in my chest, ready to carry me into the next phase of the battle that had already begun. The adrenaline from last night had barely faded when I stepped cautiously toward the bathroom where the remnants of betrayal still lingered. The clumps of hair scattered across the floor glinted in the morning light like tiny trophies of humiliation, each strand a reminder of the control Lydia had wielded and my mother had silently facilitated. My pulse quickened, but this time it wasn't purely fear, it was a mixture of anger and clarity. I needed to see the evidence for myself. I bent down, brushing aside the hair carefully, almost reverently. There, half hidden beneath a towel, were the electric clippers, the instrument of their cruelty. I lifted them, turning the polished metal over in my hands. The weight of it was oddly affirming tangible proof that what had been done to me was not accidental or impulsive. It had been deliberate, calculated, methodical. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition of the power this object now represented in my hands. Then I noticed small flecks of hair trapped in the nooks of the clippers, along with tiny, stubborn tufts still clinging to the floor. Every piece of evidence was a thread, and together they wove a picture of premeditation that was impossible to ignore. My mind raced back over the events of the evening, the way Lydia had insisted softly but firmly that this had to happen, the way my mother had acquiesced, the cold, procedural tone of my father when he spoke of timing and propriety. The mosaic of betrayal became horrifyingly clear, yet at the same time, it became a tool I could use. I moved to the small cabinet where the sedative-laced tea had been left last night. The cup, now empty, still carried a faint scent of chamomile mixed with something sharp and chemical. My stomach churned, remembering the haze that had dulled my reflexes, my ability to protest, to defend myself. I touched the cup, noting the residue clinging to the porcelain. That simple vessel had been the gateway to manipulation, and now it served as a clue to the calculated orchestration of my humiliation. A notebook lay discarded on the vanity open to a page where Lydia had scrawled reminders about the timing, about my mother's compliance, about ensuring it happens before she notices fully. My breath caught. It was explicit, undeniable evidence of intent, a blueprint for the night's cruelty. I could feel a strange combination of nausea and empowerment, the raw emotion of knowing just how far they had plotted, mingling with the first stirrings of control. I gathered the clippers, the hair, the cup, and the notebook, carefully placing them in a tote bag I found in the closet. Every item I handled was a piece of leverage proof of the betrayal I had endured. My mind shifted, assembling the pieces, connecting them with the events of the evening. Lydia hadn't acted alone. My parents had been complicit, their concern less about my well-being and more about her satisfaction and maintaining appearances. Each revelation fueled a slow, burning determination that began to replace the raw fear from the night before. I paused, pressing my hands to my scalp, feeling the tender skin, remembering the indignity, the helplessness, and the humiliation. And yet underneath it all, I felt a spark of strategy. If this evidence could be preserved, presented, and timed correctly, it could shift the balance of power entirely. This was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming agency, turning the tools of oppression into instruments of accountability. The possibilities unfolded in my mind, a careful public reveal that would leave no room for denial, a demonstration that their careful orchestration and favoritism could not escape scrutiny. The clippers were no longer just a weapon against me. They were the key to exposing the truth, to asserting control over the narrative that had always been dictated by them. I secured the items in my bag and drew a deep, steadying breath. My pulse had slowed, replaced by the precise rhythm of a plan beginning to form. Fear was still present, but now it was tempered by purpose. Rage had sharpened into focus, and humiliation had transformed into leverage. Tomorrow, they had expected me to be silent, powerless, and compliant. Tomorrow, with this evidence in hand and the right strategy unfolding, they would finally see that the wronged could be the most formidable of warriors. By mid-morning, the house was stirring. Voices floated from the kitchen, polite and controlled, but every syllable carried the weight of calculation. I stayed in my room, clippers and prescription bottle secured, beside me listening. Margot's soft, measured tones tried to rationalize, to minimize the act of betrayal. "It was just a precaution," she murmured. "Lydia didn't mean to upset you. You must understand her anxiety." Her words, meant to placate, only stoked the fire that had been quietly burning inside me. I felt the familiar pull of decades past, the same currents that had carried me through birthdays, ignored achievements overlooked, and accomplishments silently devalued. Every minor slight, every carefully measured comparison had led to this moment. And now they were attempting to gaslight me again, to erase my anger, my pain, my rightful indignation. I leaned back against the bed, letting my fingers trace the edge of the mirror, and the memories came unbidden. The recital where my solo was dismissed in favor of my sister's minor performance. The promotion that was overlooked because Lydia had asked my father for advice on her career instead. The holiday dinner when my carefully prepared speech was interrupted so my achievements could be overshadowed by someone else's flourish. Each incident had been small, inconsequential in isolation, but together they formed a tapestry of favoritism, manipulation, and silent oppression. The haze of sedation was gone now. Clarity sharpened every edge of my mind. I realized I could no longer allow their manipulation to define me, no longer permit their carefully constructed reality to dictate my emotions or my actions. The humiliation of the morning, the clippers, the scattered hair, the raw scalp was undeniable. But so too was the power I now possessed. I had evidence. I had witnesses in Aunt Fiona and David. I had the control to plan to orchestrate to reclaim not only my dignity, but the narrative itself. I closed my eyes and let the anger pulse through me, a steady rhythm of awareness rather than chaos. I would not react impulsively. I would plan. The sedative's haze had slowed my body, but my mind was firing in full clarity. I began to outline the day in my head, how to appear composed to the guests, how to time the evidence, how to turn every whispered comment, every judging glance into validation of my courage. Each step was deliberate, each gesture calculated. Anger turned to resolve, and resolve hardened into strategy. I could see the day unfolding like a chessboard. Every player, every move accounted for, every opportunity leveraged. They had tried to break me, to humiliate me, to make me shrink into submission. But now, armed with knowledge, evidence, and intent, I realized something vital. I would not shrink. I would rise. I straightened, placing the veil over my shoulders once more, feeling the fabric settle like armor. The moments of isolation, reflection, and remembrance had crystallized my purpose. Today would not be dictated by fear or by the manipulations of those who sought to control me. Today, I would step into the storm fully aware, fully prepared, and fully unafraid. The morning light had fully claimed the room when Fiona and the stylist arrived, each carrying a quiet confidence that steadied me more than I realized. I could feel the lingering tremor from last night's events, but now it was tempered by resolve. Fiona placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as she surveyed the damage, her eyes warm but sharp. Clara, today isn't about hiding. It's about showing them what they underestimated. The stylist, a petite woman with precise hands and an unwavering gaze, approached with the wedding dress and veil. We've worked with cancer patients, actresses, anyone who has had to redefine beauty, she said gently. We'll make sure everyone sees courage today. Her words, though professional, carried a subtle encouragement, and I realized I needed no disguise. The baldness itself could be a statement, a banner of strength in a room prepared for my humiliation. Fiona guided me through, adjusting the veil, draping it carefully so that it framed my scalp like a halo rather than hiding it. Let the fabric catch the light, she instructed. Let every eye see your face, your head, your defiance. This isn't concealment. It's declaration. I felt a strange power in those words, a reclamation of authority I hadn't known I still possessed. As the stylist worked on the dress, smoothing the fabric and fastening the clasps, I examined myself in the mirror. The baldness was stark, unflinching, but it no longer felt like vulnerability. It felt like armor, each curve of my skull, a testament to endurance, each strand of hair left behind a memory I had survived. The veil, floating lightly over my shoulders, added gravity, an almost ethereal quality that transformed the morning's horror into presence. Fiona coached me through posture and movement, reminding me that every step I took would speak louder than whispers. Walk with authority, she said. Hold your head high. They will try to judge, to pity, to whisper, but you decide what they see. I inhaled deeply, tasting the sharpness of resolve. Every moment I had spent on the floor of my childhood room, every fragment of evidence I had discovered, every memory of decades-long favoritism, now it fused into clarity. I let myself embrace it fully. This baldness, this exposure. The humiliation became my fuel, the betrayal, my impetus. I was no longer a victim waiting for mercy. I was a woman, standing at the threshold of control, transforming trauma into visibility, defiance, and undeniable presence. I took one last look at the reflection, the veil framing my face, the dress flowing, the shoulders squared. I wasn't hiding from them. I was walking into the day with full awareness, every element of my appearance, a carefully chosen message. The ceremony would begin soon, and with it, the moment to translate fear into power would arrive. The hallway outside the bridal suite felt heavier than usual, charged with anticipation and the faint scent of perfume and flowers. Nathan appeared, first his eyes widening the instant he saw me. For a heartbeat, I thought the world had shifted and I could feel the tension in his posture, the subtle hesitation in his step. His lips pressed into a thin line, conflicted, unsure how to respond to the sight of his mother bald on her wedding day. "Mom," he said, voice low, uncertain, as if testing the sound. There was worry there, yes, but also a trace of guilt, the recognition of a betrayal he hadn't caused but had witnessed countless times before, in more subtle forms. I met his eyes steady and offered a small, controlled nod. "Nathan," I said softly, "today isn't about fear. It's about presence. Remember that." He swallowed hard, shifting his weight. His gaze flicked briefly toward the mirror, then back at me, and I sensed his mind racing, trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what he now faced. There was an awkwardness, a hesitation that almost unsettled me, but I held my ground. I was no longer the girl waiting for approval or permission. I was a woman who had reclaimed agency over the chaos forced upon her. Then David Sterling arrived, his presence calm, but commanding the kind of authority that steadied even the most turbulent moments. He came to my side and placed a hand gently on my shoulder. "Clara," he said, voice steady and warm, "you are not defined by what they did. You are defined by how you face it. I see your strength." His eyes held the kind of validation that I hadn't realized I craved so deeply. It wasn't pity or sympathy. This was recognition, acknowledgement of my agency and my courage. I inhaled, letting the calm steadiness of his support fill the hollow spaces left by doubt and betrayal. Every fiber of my body relaxed, my confidence rising with each measured breath. Nathan exhaled slowly beside me, the tension easing from his shoulders as he allowed himself to witness the resolve in my stance. I caught his hand lightly, a gesture of connection and mutual understanding. For the first time that morning, I felt a sense of alignment, the unspoken agreement that I would not face the day alone, that my power and my voice were legitimate and recognized by those who truly mattered. The veil draped elegantly, the dress flowed around my feet, and the mirror reflected a woman fully aware of her strength. The emotional beat shifted. I wasn't just prepared to face the family, the guests, or Lydia's expectations. I was prepared to wield the evidence, the indignation, and the clarity I had cultivated into action. With Nathan and David beside me, I felt an anchor to reality, a tether to affirmation, and a spark of courage that could not be extinguished. The morning moved deliberately, each minute weighted with anticipation. Lydia appeared in the hallway, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes betrayed a glimmer of calculation. She lingered near the floral arrangements, offering comments coated with false concern. "Clara, are you sure that veil will sit properly? You know it might draw attention," she said, her voice light, teasing just enough to unsettle. I met her gaze steadily, allowing only a subtle tightening of my jaw to betray awareness. Her attempt at psychological sabotage was transparent, a familiar tactic I had endured in countless minor confrontations over the years. I refused to rise to the bait. Calm composed every movement, intentional. I let the words wash over me like water against stone, noting the effort and storing it for later. Aunt Fiona hovered nearby, a quiet sentinel. She whispered reminders of strategy, small nudges to reinforce posture, tone, and timing. "Remember, clarity and precision are your allies. Let them underestimate the control you have," she murmured. Her presence, steady and authoritative, was grounding. Each subtle adjustment, how I held the veil, the measured tilt of my chin, the controlled cadence of my breathing, was part of the performance I intended, one that would transform humiliation into assertion. David moved beside me quietly, reviewing the sequence we had rehearsed with Tommy, our AV ally. He checked the timing, ensuring that every audio clip, every piece of evidence would be triggered exactly when it would carry maximum impact. His calm, methodical energy reinforced my own sense of control. Together, we had created a choreography of revelation designed to leave no room for misinterpretation or dismissal. Lydia continued her subtle maneuvers, offering advice on minor details that seemed considerate, but were loaded with intent. "You might want to soften that stance," she said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. I nodded politely, but internally cataloged her words. Every suggestion, every friendly warning became part of the mental map. I was constructing a roadmap of her manipulation to be exposed when the time came. I took a moment to adjust the veil once more, letting the fabric settle over my shoulders, framing my bald head like a deliberate symbol rather than a concession to shame. Each fold, each line felt purposeful. I drew in a measured breath, the surge of adrenaline tempered by strategy. Today was no longer merely a day of ceremonies. It was a controlled operation. The morning stretched, deliberate and taut, every movement calculated, every interaction a test. I could feel the tension thickening, a taut cord that bound my composure to the impending confrontation. With Fiona, David, and the careful orchestration of evidence at my side, I knew the moment of revelation was approaching. The chapel doors opened to a soft murmur of activity, the shuffle of guests finding their seats and whispering greetings. I paused just inside, letting my eyes sweep over the gathered faces. At 57, standing bald beneath the veil, I felt every gaze settle on me with the intensity of scrutiny, curiosity, and judgment. Some eyes widened surprise, flickering across their expressions. Others lingered in quiet disapproval, as if they had come expecting tradition and perfection, and instead were confronted with a defiance that demanded acknowledgement. I drew a deep, measured breath, the hum of whispers washing over me. Each step toward the altar was deliberate, controlled, each movement a statement of presence. Aunt Fiona walked just behind me, her hand brushing lightly against my elbow, a subtle reminder that I was not alone. David stayed to my side, a quiet anchor, his eyes reassuring and steady. Every detail I had rehearsed, the tilt of my chin, the squared shoulders, the fluid sway of the veil, was a message. I was unashamed, unafraid, and fully aware. The aisle stretched before me, a narrow path lined with expectations, judgments, and the silent weight of decades of family dynamics. Whispers shifted to audible comments as I moved, soft gasps and murmurs trailing behind my steps. I could feel the tension ripple through the crowd like a current, a barely contained energy waiting for release. Each footfall on the polished wood was a metronome marking the pace of control I had reclaimed. I caught glimpses of familiar faces, friends who had known me for years, community members accustomed to appearances, and of course, my family. Nathan's expression was taut, conflicted, the flash of doubt and fear mingling with pride and uncertainty. My mother's eyes darted nervously, trying to anticipate my reaction. My sister-in-law Lydia's composure, now tight, almost fragile. She had expected submission tears, a retreat into humiliation. Instead, she saw determination, framed by elegance, a bald head adorned with flowing veil transforming the room's perception. The soft light filtered through stained glass, painting shards of color across my dress and skin. I felt the energy of the audience shift subtly, curiosity and tension now mingling with the faintest trace of admiration. Their judgmental eyes, once a looming threat, became instruments of awareness, reflections of their own assumptions and expectations. I was no longer merely the subject of observation. I was the author of this moment, shaping how it would be remembered. With every step, I internalized the contrast between the room's expectations and my reality. The whispers, the stares, the suppressed reactions. They were all threads in a tapestry I was about to unravel with precision. Each heartbeat reinforced my resolve, each breath an affirmation that the power of composure and courage could confront even the most critical eyes. I reached the front of the aisle, pausing for a heartbeat to let the weight of the moment settle. The chapel had grown quiet tension, rippling like the hush before a storm. I was poised, unyielding, ready to take the next step, the step that would shift the energy from silent observation to undeniable reckoning. I took my first step down the aisle, the polished wood gleaming beneath my heels, the soft rustle of my dress blending with the murmur of the guests. Every eye was on me, yet the weight of their scrutiny no longer threatened to unbalance me. Instead, I felt anchored, the veil draped elegantly over my shoulders, framing the bare expanse of my scalp like a crown. Each step became a deliberate statement, a visual assertion that I was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by how I chose to respond. The room was quiet tension, coiling like a live wire in the air. I noticed subtle shifts in posture, quick glances exchanged among family members and friends. I caught Nathan's gaze taut with conflicted emotions and David's steady, reassuring presence at my side. Each heartbeat reminded me of the journey that had brought me here, decades of subtle oppression, favoritism, and overlooked achievements culminating in a single harrowing act intended to humiliate. But the veil, flowing and deliberate, turned that humiliation into power. I inhaled deeply, the air thick with anticipation. With every step, I felt the past unraveling behind me, the whispered comparisons, the ignored accomplishments, the constant undercurrent of expectation and judgment. I recalled the birthdays where my contributions were minimized, the accolades overlooked the subtle but persistent messaging that my role was secondary. Every strand of hair lost every patch of exposed skin from last night's betrayal, now became a symbol not of submission, but of endurance and reclamation. The guests shifted their murmurs, fading as realization dawned. Some faces softened admiration, replacing surprise and pity. I could see the unspoken recognition that this woman standing before them, bald, poised, and composed, was not a victim, but a figure of authority, commanding attention, not through conformity, but through deliberate defiance. The veil caught the light, casting a halo-like glow around my face, emphasizing the starkness of my transformation. It wasn't concealment, it was amplification, turning vulnerability into visibility, exposure into empowerment. Every step brought me closer to the altar, yet with each one, my internal resolve solidified. I embraced the weight of the moment fully, the audacity, the courage, the meticulous orchestration that had led to this point. The whispers of judgment that had once plagued me seemed inconsequential, now mere echoes against the clarity of purpose that guided me. I felt the small, steady rhythm of defiance building into a certainty that I had never known before. The power to dictate the narrative, to transform trauma into authority, lay entirely in my hands. I glanced briefly at Lydia, her expression shifting imperceptibly, a flicker of doubt crossing her carefully constructed mask. She had expected compliance, embarrassment, perhaps tears, but instead she saw intention, strategy, and strength. Margot's eyes darted nervously, her composure wavering, as she recognized that the woman she had tried to control was now fully sovereign in her own skin. My presence alone was an assertion, a challenge, and a testament to resilience. The final steps to the altar felt almost ritualistic, each measured stride reinforcing my autonomy. I raised my chin, shoulders squared, allowing the veil to settle perfectly over my shoulders. I wasn't hiding. I was declaring. Every observer could see it. The woman before them was unbroken, purposeful, and fully empowered. The baldness, the veil, the precise posture all combined into a singular visual statement that transcended pity, expectation, and even admiration. It demanded recognition, commanded attention, and conveyed dignity that could not be undermined. By the time I reached the front, I felt a profound shift within myself. The humiliation of the night before had been transmuted into authority, the betrayal reshaped into resolve, and the audience had become witnesses to a transformation that was deliberate, intentional, and undeniable. I was no longer the victim of my circumstances. I was the architect of my own presence, fully aware of the power, invisibility, and the control that came from composure and courage. The quiet hum of the chapel's preparation room was punctuated by the faint clicks and beeps of the AV equipment. Tommy Chen crouched behind the console, his brow furrowed in concentration as he ran through each sequence, double-checking audio levels, video connections, and the timing of the presentation. I leaned against the doorway, scanning the rows of seats where the guests would soon be, every detail of the room etched into my mind. Aunt Fiona stood beside me, clipboard in hand, her calm, steady presence a counterbalance to the jitter of anticipation building in my chest. "Timing is everything," she said, quietly. "We need to make sure the reveal hits exactly when it should not, a second early, not a second late." Her eyes swept over me, offering reassurance that made the weight of strategy feel lighter. I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. Every element had to be precise, the sequence of the audio clips, the screens displaying the evidence, even the subtle cues we had rehearsed between Tommy David and me. One misstep could deflate the impact, give the audience a chance to dismiss the reality we were about to expose. This was not merely about humiliation, it was about truth, accountability, and finally, reclaiming the narrative that had been stolen from me for decades. Tommy leaned forward, adjusting the microphone levels. "Clara, I've tested every connection twice," he said, his voice low but confident. "The audio, the video, the display, they'll trigger exactly when you give the signal. Nothing will slip through." I gave him a brief nod, appreciating the precision of his focus. I knew he understood the stakes. The stakes weren't only technical, they were deeply personal, emotionally and socially. Fiona moved beside me, whispering a last-minute reminder. "Remember to breathe. Keep your posture controlled. Every movement, every glance will amplify the impact of the evidence. The room is tense already. Your presence alone will heighten it." I exhaled slowly, letting the rhythm of her instructions anchor me. The power of calm of preparation was now my weapon. Tommy adjusted the positioning of the screens, making sure they would be visible from every seat without appearing intrusive. The clips of Lydia's ultimatum, my mother's compliance, and the audio of their conversations would be synchronized with images of the clippers, the prescription bottle, and the scattered hair. Each piece of evidence had been carefully selected to leave no room for doubt, to transform speculation into irrefutable fact. I moved through the space, double-checking my cues with David and Fiona. My hands brushed the edge of the console lightly, the tactile sensation grounding me in the reality of what we were about to do. I had spent hours mentally rehearsing the sequence, mapping out the emotional arcs and reactions we wanted to evoke. Fear, tension, disbelief, all would be amplified by timing, placement, and my own controlled demeanor. Aunt Fiona leaned close, lowering her voice. "This is your moment, Clara. You've prepared, you've strategized, and you've reclaimed your power. The truth will speak for itself, but you will guide it." I nodded, letting the words settle like armor over my nerves. Every second leading up to the ceremony had been a test of patience, control, and focus, and now it all converged into this delicate, high-stakes orchestration. The chapel's interior was still emptying of staff, and the first few guests had begun to arrive, their movements, a quiet prelude to the storm we were about to unleash. I felt my pulse settle into a controlled rhythm, my mind aligning with the sequence we had painstakingly planned. The screens, microphones, and hidden cameras were all in place, ready to transmit the truth. There was no margin for error, but I trusted the team, trusted the preparation, and most importantly, trusted myself. With one final glance at the screens and the equipment, I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of anticipation settle into clarity. The moment of exposure was imminent. The reception hall was filled now, a soft murmur of conversation, punctuated by the clinking of glasses and the rustle of dresses. I stood near the front, the AV equipment in place. Aunt Fiona at my side, and David just behind me, his presence steady and reassuring. Each breath I drew was deliberate, each beat of my heart a reminder of the hours, days, and decades of strategy, preparation, and endurance that had led to this moment. The first screen flickered to life, subtle, at first drawing only the periphery of attention. I gave Tommy a small nod, and the carefully sequenced presentation began. Audio recordings of Lydia's ultimatum played through the room with crystal clarity. "Shave her head, or I leave the family forever," her voice demanded, sharp and unyielding. Gasps spread across the hall as the audience absorbed the reality of what had been whispered, manipulated, and hidden. I allowed myself a small exhale, letting the tension shift from internal preparation to external execution. The images followed photographs of the clippers, the prescription bottle, the scattered hair clippings, each one a visual confirmation of the audio. Every detail had been documented meticulously. The evidence left no room for interpretation, no excuses, no denials. The room went silent, the collective intake of breath heavy and deliberate, like a held note stretched taut across the crowd. Margot's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief, and Nathan's face mirrored the tension between shock and helplessness. Lydia's posture stiffened, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she recognized that control had slipped irrevocably from her hands. The authority she had wielded in private was gone. The public eye was unflinching, unrelenting, and utterly impartial. I watched their faces, the realization slowly dawning, the social panic creeping in like a tide. Whispers turned to murmurs of astonishment, some guests glancing between each other, their expressions teetering between horror and fascination. The murmurs grew louder, rippling through the hall as everyone processed the magnitude of what had occurred, the premeditation, the collusion, the betrayal that had been executed under the guise of family loyalty. I felt a swell of clarity and empowerment. This was no longer about humiliation or fear. This was justice, meticulously orchestrated and fully realized. I had taken the tools of my degradation and turned them into instruments of accountability. Every photograph, every receipt, every audio clip was a testament not to my vulnerability, but to my control, my courage, and my refusal to remain silent. David's hand brushed lightly against my shoulder, grounding me in the moment. Aunt Fiona's steady gaze reminded me that I was supported, that the strategy had been flawless, and that the room's silence was a prelude to the reckoning we had anticipated. I allowed the presentations to unfold naturally, letting the evidence speak louder than any words I might utter. Lydia's face was pale, the mask of sophistication and composure shattered. Margot's eyes darted around, calculating, searching desperately for a means to mitigate the damage, to salvage the family image that had always been their priority. It was too late. The audience, now fully aware of the deception, watched with a mixture of disbelief and judgment. The power had shifted irrevocably. I felt a surge of triumph, not from cruelty, but from the validation of truth. The manipulation, the threats, the betrayal, they were exposed, undeniable and unassailable. I had reclaimed the narrative, transformed fear into authority and humiliation into empowerment. In that moment, I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was the orchestrator of justice, and the room bore witness to it. The air in the reception hall felt different now, charged with the aftermath of truth revealed. Lydia and my parents hovered near the edge of the room, faces pale, expressions taut with disbelief and unease. The room had shifted. The whispers that had rippled through the audience earlier were now subdued, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of the courage that had just unfolded before them. I took a measured breath, letting the power of composure settle through my body. Every step I had taken, every detail of preparation, had led to this moment. My allies Fiona and David flanked me subtly, a protective presence that reinforced my autonomy. I could feel their reassurance, not as crutches, but as affirmation that I had navigated this confrontation with precision and clarity. The evidence had done its work, and the public exposure of manipulation and betrayal had shifted the balance irrevocably. The wedding continued around me, the music weaving through the tension like a thread of normalcy. Guests returned to the celebration, some with tentative smiles, others still absorbing the reality of what had been exposed. Yet I moved through it differently, no longer encumbered by fear or humiliation. Every interaction, every glance was informed by a deep understanding of my own strength. The veil over my shoulders caught the light again, a subtle halo that mirrored the inner authority I now possessed. Nathan approached, hesitant at first, then steadier as he reached my side. "Mom," he said, his voice low and careful, "you were incredible. I don't think anyone expected—" He trailed off words unnecessary. I understood. The awe, the validation was evident in his eyes. I nodded, acknowledging his support without diminishing my own agency. This moment was mine, but it was also a lesson in recognition. Seeing the courage in action inspires even those who hesitate. David remained beside me, a quiet anchor of trust and understanding. "Clara," he said softly, "your strength is undeniable. Today proved what I already knew: you are unshakable, uncompromising, and unafraid." I allowed myself a fleeting smile, absorbing the reassurance. It was not flattery, not pity. It was acknowledgement of a truth I had long carried, but had been denied the space to express fully. I turned my gaze toward the dance floor. The guests. The laughter that now returned in bursts. I realized that empowerment was not only about public vindication, it was about reclaiming self-respect, establishing boundaries, and asserting dignity in a space where I had previously been minimized. The humiliation of the night before the betrayal by those I had trusted most had been transformed into a declaration of presence. I was fully visible, fully in command, and entirely unashamed. Fiona approached, a quiet smile on her face. "You handled everything beautifully," she said, her tone measured yet warm. "Not just the reveal, but the way you carried yourself afterward. That control, it's yours. Don't let anyone diminish it." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of closure. Her words confirmed what I already knew. I had navigated betrayal, manipulation, and public scrutiny, without losing myself, without allowing anger to obscure strategy, and without surrendering my dignity. The ceremony that had been intended to humiliate me had instead solidified my authority, reshaping perception and reclaiming narrative. Guests were engaged, attentive, and respectful. My allies were present, vigilant and supportive, and I finally felt the profound satisfaction of justice tempered by composure. The room had borne witness not to revenge in its rawest form, but to the deliberate assertion of personal power and integrity. As the evening wore on, I allowed myself to reflect quietly, internally. The past decades of favoritism, suppression, and emotional manipulation had not vanished, but they no longer held dominion over me. The betrayal had been real, the hurt profound, but the reclamation of control, dignity, and self-respect was absolute. I had faced deception, confrontation, and public scrutiny, and emerged whole. Weeks have passed since the wedding, and the echoes of that day still linger in my mind. At 57, I never imagined that one night could hold such betrayal, and one day could demand such courage. Sitting quietly in my study, I reflect on what has changed, not just in the eyes of my family or our community, but within myself. The public exposure, the evidence, the careful orchestration. It all mattered, yes, but the true victory was internal. For the first time in decades, I feel untethered from the patterns that had governed my life. I no longer measure my worth against the approval of others, and I no longer allow manipulation, subtle or overt, to shape my choices. Breaking these cycles has been painful, exhausting, and profoundly liberating. Fiona's support, David's unwavering presence, Nathan's eventual acknowledgement. They were constants that reminded me I am not alone. They reinforced what I already knew. Dignity cannot be borrowed, it must be claimed. Each moment I stood poised in the chapel, walked down the aisle, and allowed the evidence to speak was an act of reclamation. The shame intended for me became a testament to my resilience. I think about Lydia and my parents, their attempts to control, to manipulate, to suppress the truth. Their reactions now are distant echoes, powerless in the face of my self-possession. I have learned that triumph is not defined by their humiliation, but by the clarity, composure, and strength I brought to the situation. I rose above their expectations, above the toxicity that had shadowed my life, and in doing so, I discovered the full measure of my own authority. The lessons are clear. Courage is cultivated, power is claimed, and freedom is exercised through deliberate action. Life at 57 has proven that it is never too late to redefine yourself, to reclaim agency, and to step into your own narrative. I am no longer a passive participant in the expectations of others. I am the author of my story, and every choice, every measured response affirms that truth and integrity matter more than the preservation of appearances. I close my eyes briefly, allowing a small smile to settle over me. The cycles are broken, independence secured, and growth undeniable. The past remains, but it no longer dictates my path.